1044. The first thing you need to understand is the ember. Not a fire, not a hearth roaring with logs, just one ember the size of a thumbnail glowing orange in the bottom of a cast-iron stove on a freezing night in the Asheville Marches. Outside that stove, the world is going to ruin. The wind is screaming through the broken watchtowers along the ridge. The pine forests are bent sideways under ice. The mountain pass below is empty of traders, empty of soldiers, empty of anyone with the sense to be somewhere warmer. But inside that stove, a single ember is still alive, and a man is feeding it with strips of bark, one piece at a time, the way another man might feed a sick child. Now pull back, let the camera lift. Above the hut, the ridge falls away into a long valley of frozen pine. Beyond the valley, the broken watchtowers of the old border line stand crooked against the sky, their stones blackened by a war nobody remembers winning. Beyond the watchtowers, the lowland villages glitter faintly with chimney smoke, fewer of them lit every winter. And beyond all of that, far to the south where the maps go from green to gold, the spires of the draconic capital catch the last of the dying sun. In that capital, a young dragon queen is being slowly poisoned by her own court. In the lowland villages, mothers are stretching one loaf of bread across 4 days. In the broken watchtowers, no one stands watch. And on this ridge in this stone hut, a man named Tomas Vance is ladling stew into 5 small wooden bowls. He sets them on the cold stone step outside his door, like he has done every evening for 184 evenings. He limps back inside. He shuts the door. He does not look to see who comes for the bowls. He does not want to know. He has decided in the way that only a man with nothing left can decide, that not knowing is its own kind of mercy. This is the story of how that man saved a kingdom. He never lifted a sword to do it. He never made a speech. He never knew until the end that he had done anything at all. This is the chronicle of the cook on the ridge, the hatchlings he fed, and the empire that survived because of a stove that never went cold. Before we go further, you need to understand who Tomas Vance was, because the popular telling of this story has already begun to lie about him. The bards in the lowland taverns sing of a noble hermit, a holy man, a wise elder who took in the lost. That is not what he was. He would have laughed at all of it. Tomas Vance was 52 years old, born to a baker in a river town that no longer exists. He joined the kingdom's army at 16 because the baker's shop burned down, and the army was the only place that fed a man without asking what his father did. He was not a soldier. He was a cook. For 31 years he stood behind iron stoves in canvas tents and stone barracks, feeding men who were about to die and men who had just killed. He learned every trick a poor cook learns. How to make old grain taste new. How to stretch a single chicken across 40 men. How to make boiled roots feel like a meal instead of a sentence. He was, by every account that matters, very good at his work. He was also, by every account that matters, a difficult man. He talked back to officers. He gave extra bread to prisoners. He once threw a pot of boiling water at a sergeant who kicked a dog. The end of his military career came on a spring morning 7 years before this story begins, in a war the kingdom does not like to discuss. His commanding officer ordered him to mix a satchel of gray powder into the water barrels being shipped to an enemy garrison. The powder, he was told, would make the enemy sick. It would not kill them. It was a small thing, a useful thing. Tomas Vance asked what would happen to the children in the garrison town, who also drank that water. The commanding officer told him to stop asking questions. Tomas Vance emptied the satchel into the officer's tea instead. The officer did not die. He spent 4 weeks in a field hospital and never fully recovered the use of his left hand. Tomas was court-martialed, stripped of rank, denied his pension, and exiled north to the Asheville Marches with a limp from where the sergeant-at-arms had broken his knee with a rifle butt during arrest. That was who arrived on this ridge 7 winters ago. A broken-kneed army cook with a stove, a sack of dried beans, and exactly one stubborn opinion about what a man is and is not allowed to do. The Asheville marches were the kingdom's forgotten edge. 3 days' ride from the nearest lowland town, half a year of winter, wolves in the foothills, no magistrate, no temple, no garrison. The only people who lived there were people who could not live anywhere else, trappers who had killed someone, widows who had outlived their villages, a hermit or two who claimed visions though no one wrote them down. Nothing important was supposed to happen here. That was the point of the place. Tomas Vance built nothing grand. He repaired an abandoned shepherd's hut, patched the roof with pine shake, set his stove against the north wall, and dug a small root cellar into the slope behind the door. He hunted poorly because of his knee, so he traded. He walked down the ridge once a month with smoked rabbit and came back with flour, salt, lentils, a little dried fish. He spoke to almost no one. He cooked for himself. He ate alone. And then, on a night 6 winters ago, in the middle of a blizzard, he heard something scratching at his door. He opened it expecting a wolf. He found instead 5 very small creatures, half buried in snow, shivering against the stone step. They were dragons. He knew that much. Everyone in the kingdom knew what dragons looked like. But these were not the dragons of the songs. These were no bigger than house cats, with thin wings folded tight against their bodies, with scales that had not yet hardened, with eyes too large for their faces. A normal man would have shut the door. A wise man would have shut the door. Tomas Vance, who was neither, looked at the 5 small creatures, sighed the long sigh of a man who has decided to make his life more difficult, and went inside to put a pot on the stove. That night he set out 5 small wooden bowls on the cold stone step. Inside each bowl, a thin stew of barley, lentils, and a strip of smoked rabbit. He shut the door and did not watch them eat. He thought, the way a tired man thinks, that this would happen once, that in the morning the bowls would be empty and the hatchlings would be gone, and the story would end. The bowls were empty in the morning. The hatchlings were not gone. They were waiting on the step at dusk the next evening, and the evening after that, and the evening after that. This is how a ritual begins, not with a vow, not with a plan, with a man too tired to say no. To understand what was happening on that ridge, you have to understand what was happening in the rest of the kingdom. Because Tomas Vance, in his stone hut at the edge of the world, did not know it, but he had begun feeding stew to the most dangerous orphans in the Draconic realm. The Draconic kingdom had been ruled for 9 centuries by a single line of dragons, and for most of those centuries it had been ruled well. Dragons live long. Dragons remember. A dragon king who watched his own great-great-grandfather rule does not make the same mistakes twice. The kingdom was, by the standards of the world, an unusually fair place. Humans and dragons lived in the same towns. They paid the same taxes. They sat in the same courts. The crown did not love its human subjects, but it did not eat them either, which in this part of the world counted as a golden age. Then 3 years before our story begins, the old king died. His heir was a young dragon named Saoirse. She had been raised quietly, kept out of court politics, sent away to study with scholars in the eastern reaches. She returned to the capital for her coronation and found a court that did not know her, did not trust her, and in many quarters did not want her. The trouble was not that she was young. Dragons are patient about youth. The trouble was that she was kind. There is a faction within the dragon nobility that has always believed kindness is a disease. They call themselves the Pale Court, after the pale gold of their scales, and they had been waiting for a weak monarch for 200 years. In Queen Saoirse they thought they had found one. She listened to human petitioners. She refused to raise the grain tax during a bad harvest. She freed a clutch of indentured workers from a noble's estate on the grounds that the contracts had been signed under duress. The Pale Court began to plot. They were led by an old gold-scaled dragon named Lord Veyron, who had served 3 kings before her and considered her unfit to serve tea, let alone rule. His plan was patient and cruel. He did not need to assassinate her. He needed only to make her reign look like a failure. If the borderlands starved, if the villages emptied, if the lowlands rioted, the High Chamber would have legal grounds to declare her unfit. The crown would pass to a regent. The regent would be him. So the Pale Court began to choke the kingdom quietly, grain shipments rerouted, salt taxes raised in the queen's name without her knowledge, garrisons pulled back from the frontiers, border passes left undefended, the villages in the foothills began to thin, the watchtowers along the ridges went dark. The Asheville Marches, where Thomas Vance lived, were strategically the most important and politically the most forgotten region in the kingdom. The mountain pass through the Marches was the only northern route the Pale Court had not yet fully infiltrated. If the queen could hold the Marches, she could hold a corridor. If she lost the Marches, she lost the north entirely, and with it her crown. She knew this. She did not know who in the Marches she could trust. The few reports that reached her from the region were filtered through Pale Court hands. The names of loyal subjects came back to her as the names of traitors. The names of traitors came back as heroes. She needed eyes she could trust. She needed eyes the Pale Court would not think to watch. She needed someone small. This is where the hatchlings come in. But we are not there yet. For now, the kingdom is sliding toward ruin. The young queen is alone in her chambers, drafting letters she cannot send. The Pale Court is counting its soldiers and its gold, and on a ridge in the Asheville Marches, a disgraced army cook is standing over a stove, complaining out loud to nobody about the quality of his lentils. The ritual on the ridge looked, from the outside, like the smallest thing in the world. Every evening at dusk, Thomas Vance lit his stove. He measured out a portion of barley, a portion of lentils, whatever scrap of meat he had, a handful of dried roots from the cellar. He simmered it for an hour. He talked to the stew. He talked to himself. He talked, though he did not know it, to an audience. The 5 hatchlings arrived at dusk every night without fail. They sat in a row on the stone step, exactly the same order each time, and waited. The order, for those who care about such things, was this. Ember on the left, the largest, scales the color of banked coals, eyes the color of sunset. Cinder beside her, slightly smaller, ash-gray, quiet, watchful. Myra in the middle, the only one with green in her scales, the only one who ever made a sound, a soft chittering that Thomas had decided meant hello. Bramble beside her, brown and broad-shouldered for his size, slow-moving, deliberate. And Quill on the far right, the smallest of the 5, dark blue with silver at the wing tips, with eyes that did not blink for a long, long time. Thomas would open the door, limp out with 5 small wooden bowls on a tray, set them down on the step, apologize. This was the part the hatchlings had come to understand best. Thomas Vance apologized constantly. He apologized for the thinness of the broth. He apologized when the rabbit was tough. He apologized when he had to substitute turnip for parsnip. He apologized, one memorable night, for a small piece of charcoal that had fallen into the pot from the stove. "I'm sorry about that," he said, lifting it carefully out of Cinder's bowl with 2 fingers. "I had it on too high. I'll do better tomorrow." Cinder, who would not know what charcoal tasted like for another 40 years, regarded him with what Thomas read as patience, and what was actually careful observation. He apologized for the salt. He apologized when he had no salt. He apologized for the weather, which was not his fault, and for his knee, which made him slow, and for his singing, which he did sometimes when the stew was nearly ready, an old marching song from his army days, off-key, half the lyrics forgotten. "You don't have to listen to that," he would say halfway through the 2nd verse. "Sorry, I'll stop." He did not stop. The hatchlings did not move from the step. And every night, after they had eaten, and after Thomas had gone back inside, and after the door had shut against the wind, the smallest of them, Quill, the dark blue one with silver at the wing tips, would slip into the shadow of the wood pile, draw out from beneath her wing a tiny leather-bound book no bigger than a playing card, and scratch a careful mark into it with a claw. The book was a ledger. The marks were a rating. The rating for 184 consecutive nights was perfect. Tomas Vance did not know about the ledger. Tomas Vance did not know that Quill kept careful notes about every meal, every apology, every off-key song, every kindness extended without expectation of return. Tomas Vance, in the way of men who have decided that the world owes them nothing, and that they therefore owe the world everything, did not even know that what he was doing was being observed. He thought he was feeding orphans. He was being audited. Now we leave the ridge. We have to. The story does not make sense if we stay only with Tomas, because the truth of what was happening on that stone step was not happening on the stone step at all. It was happening 400 miles south, in a small windowless room beneath the draconic capital, where a young dragon queen was reading reports. Queen Saoirse the Quiet sat alone at a long table of black stone. The table was covered in small leather-bound books, each no bigger than a playing card, each one full of careful marks. Beside her stood her only trusted advisor, an elderly gray dragon named Cadman, who had served her father and her father's father, and who was the only voice at court she still believed. The books on the table were ledgers. There were 37 of them. Each one had been carried back to the capital across hundreds of miles by a courier no one would think to search. Each one represented a region of the kingdom. Each one was the work of a hatchling. The hatchlings, you see, were not orphans. They were not lost. They had never been lost. They were the Queen's own. The clutch of 5 had been hatched in secret in the royal hatchery the season after Saoirse's coronation. They had been raised, very quickly and very carefully, by Cadman himself. They had been taught to listen, to remember, to read character. They had been sent out into the kingdom not as spies in the ordinary sense, looking for treason and military secrets. They had been sent out as auditors of the soul. The Queen had given them a single task. "Find me," she had told them on the night before they left, "the humans who are still worth saving. Find me the ones who would feed you if you came to their door cold and small and useless. Find me those and write them down and bring me their names. Because if I am to hold this kingdom, I cannot hold it with the nobles. The nobles have already chosen Veyron. I will hold it with the cooks and the widows and the trappers and the bakers and the broken-kneed men on the edges of the maps. I will hold it with the ones nobody counts. Find me those. They are the only army I have left." The 5 hatchlings had flown out from the capital in 5 different directions, and for 2 years they had been writing. Ember tracked loyalty. She watched how humans spoke about the Queen when they thought no one was listening, and she wrote down the words. Cinder mapped food. She moved through villages and counted what was in the cellars, what was on the tables, what was in the bowls. She knew which lords were hoarding and which were sharing. Myra listened at noble estates. She perched on the high beams of dining halls and remembered every name, every alliance, every whispered plan. Bramble counted soldiers. He sat on watchtowers and ridges and roads, and he tallied banners, swords, horses, and the loyalty of the men who carried them. And Quill, the smallest of the 5 who had been hatched last and was the cleverest of them by a wide margin, was the auditor of character. She did not gather military intelligence. She did not count grain. She judged souls. She went to the doors of houses, hungry and small and pretending to be lost, and she wrote down what happened next. Most of the ledgers on the Queen's table that night were thin. Most of the houses in the kingdom had shut the door. But one ledger was thick. One ledger was nearly full. One ledger had 184 marks in a row. Cadman set that ledger gently in front of the Queen. "This is the cook on the ridge, Your Grace," he said. "In the Asheville marches. Quill has been with him since the first snow of the 2nd year." The Queen opened the ledger. She read it slowly. She read it twice. She read the entries about the charcoal in the bowl and the apology that followed. She read the entry about the night the rabbit had been tough and Tomas had eaten the worst piece himself and given the better ones to the bowls on the step. She read the entry about the night Tomas had been ill with fever, and had still crawled to the stove and made the stew, and had passed out beside it after setting the bowls outside. She read the entry, in Quill's small, careful claw script, that said only this: "He has nothing, he gives everything, he does not know who we are, he has never asked." The queen sat for a long time in the windowless room. When she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet. "How many like him," she said, "did you find?" Cadman looked at the 37 ledgers on the table. "In the entire kingdom, your grace," he said, "we found 11. To understand what the queen did next, you have to understand what Quill had seen in the rest of the kingdom. Because Tomas Vance was not a normal man. He was, in the precise and clinical accounting of a dragon hatchling with a leather ledger, the rarest creature in the realm. Let us walk through Quill's ledger for the other regions she had visited before she reached the ridge. There was Lord Aldrich of the Southern Vineyards, a wealthy human merchant who had risen to a lower title by lending money to a pale court dragon. Quill had appeared at his door one autumn evening, small and shivering, with one wing held at an angle that looked broken but was not. Lord Aldrich had opened the door himself. He had looked at her. He had laughed. He had thrown a half-eaten apple core onto the stones at her feet and shut the door. Quill's entry on him was 3 words: "Through the core." There was the merchant Edrin in the river town of Hollowmere. Edrin had opened his door, seen Quill, recognized her at once for what she was, and tried to throw a sack over her to take her to market. Quill had flown out of his grasp and watched from a rooftop as he chased shadows for an hour with the sack still in his hand. Her entry was 1 word: sail. There was the priest at the shrine of the cold saints, who had stood in his doorway in his fine wool robes and made the holy sign over Quill's head and blessed her in the name of 3 gods and shut the door without offering her water. Her entry was 2 words: no bowl. And there was the worst entry of all. There was the soldier in the village of Marrowfen. Quill had come to his door late one night. He had let her in. He had warmed her by his fire. He had fed her bread and salted fish and a little milk. He had spoken to her in a soft voice and stroked the scales between her wings. And then, while she slept, he had bound her with cord and carried her to the Pale Court's local fortress to claim the bounty Lord Veyron had quietly placed on any hatchling found wild in the borderlands. Quill had escaped barely, by chewing through the cord with teeth that were not yet hard. Her entry on him was the longest in the ledger. Fed me to sell me, worse than the one who threw the core. The one who threw the core was honest. This was the kingdom Quill had walked through. This was the kingdom of lords who laughed, merchants who grabbed, priests who blessed and turned away, soldiers who fed in order to betray. And then she had come to a stone hut on a ridge in the Asheville Marches. A broken-kneed army cook with no money, no name, no expectation of reward, no knowledge of what she was, had opened his door, sighed, and gone to put a pot on the stove. He had set out 5 bowls when he had only been visited by 1. He had assumed there were others. He had not asked. He had apologized for the broth. In the ledger of the entire Draconic kingdom, in the careful claw script of an auditor who had judged 11,000 souls and found 11 worth saving, Tomas Vance was not the most important entry by virtue of what he had done. He was the most important entry by virtue of what he had not done. He had not asked. He had not bargained. He had not hesitated. He had not, in 184 nights, ever once treated the bowls on the step as anything other than guests at a table he was honored to set. He was, in the precise accounting of a hatchling who had seen the worst of the realm, exactly what the queen had been looking for. He was the kind of man you build a kingdom on. The Pale Court moved in the deep cold of late winter, 6 weeks after Quill's full report reached the capital. Lord Veyron had grown impatient. The queen had not yet collapsed under the weight of the famines and the cold he had engineered. The lowland villages were thinning, yes, but they were not rioting. Word had begun to spread, in a way Veyron could not trace, that the queen was not the cause of the hunger, that the grain was being held in noble cellars, that the salt tax had been raised in her name without her seal. The whispers were soft, but they were growing, and Veyron understood, the way old dragons understand, that whispers are the thing that pulls down crowns. He decided to force the matter. He gave the order in his private chambers on a gray afternoon. A company of pale court riders in unmarked armor would ride north into the Asheville marches. They would burn the border villages along the lower ridge. They would salt the wells. They would leave behind evidence, false but convincing, that the burnings had been ordered by the Queen herself in punishment for the march's supposed disloyalty. The North would rise. The High Chamber would have its grounds. Veyron would have his regency before the spring thaw. The riders left the capital under cover of dusk. They moved fast. They did not know that the cleverest hatchling in the realm had been counting their banners from the rafters of Veyron's own dining hall for 2 weeks, and that Bramble had carried the warning south to the capital 3 days before the order was given. The Queen had 3 days. She used them well. She did not send an army north. An army would be too slow, and an army would be seen, and an army moving on the marches would be exactly what Veyron wanted, because it would prove to the High Chamber that the Queen was militarizing her own borderlands against her own subjects. She sent instead 3 things. A dozen quiet riders in the colors of no house, with orders to evacuate the border villages in silence and lead the people up into the high passes where the Pale Court could not follow. A small unmarked wagon carrying grain and salt and dried fish, to be left at certain agreed-upon points along the high passes where the evacuees would find it. And last, a single courier on a fast horse, carrying a sealed letter, addressed to no one, to be delivered to a stone hut on a ridge above the Asheville marches. The courier reached the ridge 2 nights before the riders did. He left the letter on the stone step among the empty bowls. He did not knock. He turned and rode south again. Tomas Vance found the letter at dawn. He read it standing in his doorway in his wool nightshirt with his bad knee aching against the cold. The letter was short. It was written in a careful hand. It said this: "Riders are coming. They mean to burn this ridge along with the villages below. Take what you can carry. Go north into the high pass before nightfall on the 2nd day. You will be looked after. You have already done more than you know. Burn this letter." There was no signature. Tomas Vance stood in the doorway for a long time. He looked out at the empty bowls on the step. He looked at the cold sky. He looked, finally, at his stove. Then he did 3 things in order that tell you everything about who he was. He burned the letter, as instructed. He packed a small bag, 2 blankets, a sack of dried beans, his best knife, a whetstone. The whetstone had belonged to his father. And then before he left, he lit his stove one last time. He cooked the last of his lentils, the last of his barley, the last strip of smoked rabbit in the cellar. He made enough stew for 5. He set 5 bowls on the stone step. He sang, off-key, an old marching song with half the lyrics forgotten. And then he closed the door behind him, limped down the back path into the pines, and was gone into the high pass before the first Pale Court rider crested the lower ridge. The riders found an empty hut at dusk. They found a cold stove. They found, on the stone step outside the door, 5 small wooden bowls, scraped clean, arranged in a careful row. They burned the hut anyway. They had their orders. But 3 of them, the youngest, looked at the empty bowls and did not speak for the rest of the night. And one of them, the youngest of all, would later that spring desert the Pale Court and ride south to throw himself on the Queen's mercy. He had seen the bowls and understood, the way young soldiers sometimes understand, that he was on the wrong side. The fall of the Pale Court was not, in the end, a battle. The historians who insist on battles for their chronicles have invented one, and you may read it in 3 different versions in 3 different libraries. None of them true. The truth was quieter and far more devastating. Queen Saoirse the Quiet called the High Chamber into session on the 1st day of spring. She did not bring an army. She did not bring witnesses. She brought, on a small silver tray carried by Cadman, a single leather-bound book no bigger than a playing card. She read from it aloud. She read the entry about Lord Aldrich and the apple core. Lord Aldrich was in the chamber. He went white. She read the entry about the merchant Edrin and the sack. Edrin was not in the chamber, but his patron, a pale court dragon of the southern reaches, was, and the dragon's pale scales began to gray. She read the entry about the priest who blessed and shut the door. She read the entry about the soldier who fed in order to betray. She read slowly the names of every pale court noble whose servants and merchants and soldiers Quill had judged and found wanting. She read the lord who had raised the salt tax in her name. She read the noble who had rerouted the grain. She read every name. She read for 2 hours. She did not raise her voice once. And then she closed the small book, and she set it on the black stone table in front of her throne, and she said this: "My kingdom is held together not by the people I trusted in this chamber. My kingdom is held together by the people you forgot to count. There is a cook on a ridge in the HFY marches. He has fed 5 strangers every night for 184 nights. He owns nothing. He asked for nothing. He did not know what they were. The 11 of you in this chamber who plotted against him and against me, and against the very idea that a kingdom should feed its hungry, you are exiled by sundown. The rest of you may stay, but you will remember every day of your remaining lives that you were judged not by me, but by an auditor smaller than your hand." And she did not blink. Lord Veyron, who had ruled 3 kings before her, opened his mouth to speak and found, for the first time in 200 years, that he had nothing to say. He was exiled by sundown. He died 8 years later in a stone tower at the edge of the world, alone, having been fed every evening by a young dragon assigned to deliver his meals on the queen's orders. The young dragon set the bowl on the step. The young dragon did not look in. The young dragon did not knock. It was, the queen had decided, the most fitting punishment she could devise. Veyron lived out his years on the receiving end of exactly the kindness he had spent his life despising, and he was made to eat it every evening until he died. Thomas Vance did not go to court. He was found in the High Pass 3 weeks after the burning by one of the Queen's quiet riders. He was thin. He was cold. His bad knee had locked. He was sitting beside a small fire with the 5 hatchlings curled around him, all of them including Quill, who had refused to leave his side for the entire journey. The rider knelt before him and offered him, on behalf of the Queen, a title, a pension, a house in the capital, a position on her personal council, and the rank of a minor noble. Thomas Vance, who was 52 years old and had been a soldier and a cook and an exile and was now apparently also something else, looked at the rider for a long time. Then he looked at the hatchlings. Then he scratched his bad knee. "I'd take a better stove," he said. The rider, who had not expected this, blinked. "A stove, sir." "Cast iron. Bigger firebox than the last one. I'd take one of those. And if it's not too much trouble, I'd take my hut rebuilt. I liked the roof on it. I patched it myself." The rider rode south. In the spring of that year, on a ridge in the HFY marches, a new stone hut was built on the foundations of the old one. The roof was patched with pine shake, exactly the way Thomas had done it. A new cast iron stove, with a larger firebox than the last, was installed against the north wall. The cellar was restocked. A small flag, in no colors of any house, was hung on a post beside the door, so that any rider who came up the ridge with bad intentions would know, the way riders know these things, that this hut was under the Queen's quiet protection and was not to be touched. Thomas Vance moved back in on the first warm night of spring. He limped to the stove, he lit it, he cooked. That evening at dusk, he set 5 small wooden bowls on the stone step. The hatchlings came. They had never stopped coming. They sat in their usual row, Ember on the left, then Cinder, then Myra, then Bramble, and last, on the right, Quill, who was still the smallest, and whose leather ledger had grown thick with new entries from a kingdom that slowly was beginning to remember how to feed itself. Thomas apologized for the broth. He thought it was thin. Quill, who had judged 11,000 souls, and found 11 worth saving, scratched a single mark into her ledger. The mark was perfect, as it had been for every night before, as it would be for every night after, for the remaining 19 years of Tomas Vance's life. He never knew what the marks were. He never asked. I am Archivist Thessaly, and I have written this chronicle in the year of the Queen's 23rd spring, for the royal record, so that what happened on a ridge in the Asheville Marches is not lost, the way these things are usually lost, to the bards in the lowland taverns who prefer their heroes loud. The hero of this chronicle was not loud. The hero of this chronicle was a broken-kneed army cook with a stubborn opinion about wells, who fed 5 strangers every night for 184 nights, and then for 19 years after that, without ever once being told what he was doing. The Pale Court counted soldiers. They counted gold. They counted votes in the high chamber. They counted everything that could be counted in the language they understood. They never thought to count the men who fed the hungry in the dark. That is why they lost. That is the only reason any kingdom worth keeping is ever kept. If you would like to read the chronicle of the 11, the other 10 souls Quill found worthy across the rest of the realm, that record is in the Queen's library now, available to any citizen who wishes to read it. There is also a chronicle, recently completed, of what became of the young Pale Court rider who saw the empty bowls on the step and could not speak. That one is worth your time as well. But this chronicle ends here, with 5 bowls steaming on a stone step at dusk, and a man inside a stone hut, singing off-key, who is sorry about the broth. He should not be sorry. The broth was always enough.